Most people don't know that the recorded number of Africans taken to Europe and America was over 12 million. However, less than 10 million reached these destinations, raising questions about what happened to around 2 million Africans. It turns out that they never survived because of the worst conditions on the slave ships and what was done to them. Rich businessmen would often finance the slave ships and voyages, but they did not know how slaves were captured and transported. However, after reaching the New World, things would become tense when the ship captains offered dismembered ears, sometimes hundreds of them. What did that mean, and how exactly was life on a slave ship which history books little talk about? Welcome to a new episode of Black Afric Diary, a channel where we talk about Black African history, culture, arts, and civilization. It's a place where you will see the real picture of Black Africa, its stories, and the events defining it. In this episode, we will tell you the hidden truths and harsh realities of life on a slave ship. Let's get started. Before setting on the Middle Passage, Africans were captured in various regions across the continent. A slave ship would come with the crew and dock at the harbor, and the crew would set on the slave hunt. Extensive slave raids were organized, and various small villages would become targets of these raids. Because Americans and Europeans used firearms, tens of them could easily take down a small African village. Once captured, enslaved Africans were marched to coastal port cities, often in long slave trains, where they were chained together. These captives came from diverse backgrounds, spoke different languages, and may never have even seen the ocean before. The journey to the coast could take weeks or even months, during which the captives endured hunger, exhaustion, and violence. From now on, they would be at the captivator's mercy. Upon arrival at the port cities, they were held in barracoons or other makeshift enclosures while awaiting shipment. The process of boarding the slave ships was itself a traumatic experience. Enslaved people were stripped of their clothing, shaved off their hair, and robbed of their remaining possessions. This act of stripping away their identity and humanity was the first step in the dehumanization process that would continue throughout their journey. By this time, Africans knew they had a different fate, worse than they could imagine. They had never experienced this kind of brutality before. Boarding could take several weeks or even months, during which time the enslaved were kept on the ship's deck in temporary wooden structures built by the crew. Then, a slave ship would come, and Africans would be loaded on it. Interestingly, crew members installed netting around the deck to prevent enslaved individuals from jumping overboard in an attempt to escape their fate. The sight of the ocean and the ship likely intensified their fear and confusion, as many had never seen such a vast body of water or been on a ship before. Olaudah Equiano, an enslaved African who later gained his freedom and became a prominent abolitionist, described his initial experience aboard a slave ship. In his autobiography, he recounted his fear and uncertainty, not knowing whether the white men intended to kill or eat him. He described seeing a multitude of Black people of every description chained together, every one of their countenances expressing dejection and sorrow. The shock and terror of this moment were overwhelming, and Equiano fainted. Once the ship was fully loaded with human cargo, the enslaved were moved below deck into cramped, dark compartments. Slave ships were designed to carry large numbers of people, but in the interest of maximizing profits, they were often packed well beyond their intended capacity. Captives were crammed into these compartments so tightly that they had only a few feet of space in which to sit, sleep, or move. The conditions below deck were harsh. The ceiling height in these compartments was often as low as 4.5 feet, forcing the enslaved to crouch or lie down. The spaces were so cramped that movement was severely restricted. The enslaved were segregated by gender and age, with men typically shackled in pairs and confined to separate compartments from women and children. Women were usually left unchained, but were confined to their designated areas. Children were often allowed to move about the ship more freely, but this did not spare them from the horrors of the journey. There were no sanitary facilities of any kind below deck. the enslaved were forced to relieve themselves where they sat, leading to a buildup of human waste that exacerbated the already unbearable conditions. The stench below deck was overwhelming. Equiano described the smell as ungodly, noting that it was so overpowering that it made him physically ill and unable to eat. The heat and lack of ventilation below the deck created a suffocating atmosphere, further contributing to the misery of the captives. However, the captain and the crew on the upper deck did not care about the slaves. They themselves were in an open space, but they never thought about the conditions the people in the lower decks might be. You see, the captured were not considered humans at all, but goods that must be stored. The conditions in the lower deck were so bad that disease would overgrow. Dysentery, known at the time as the flux, was particularly common and deadly. The disease spread rapidly in the cramped and filthy conditions, causing severe dehydration and death. John Newton, a former slave trader who later became an abolitionist, described the horrifying conditions aboard slave ships in his writings. He recounted how the floor of the rooms below deck was often covered with the blood and mucus, which had proceeded from them in consequence of the flux, that it resembled a slaughterhouse. In addition to dysentery, other diseases such as scurvy, influenza, malaria, smallpox, and measles were common on slave ships. The mortality rate during the Middle Passage was shockingly high, with estimates ranging from 10% to 20%. This means that out of the 12.5 million Africans who set out on the journey, approximately 1.8 to 2.5 million did not survive the voyage. To this point, slaves were being traumatized by the worst conditions of the ship itself. However, they did not know what awaited them because the crew and the captain had plans to establish their authority. For this, extreme cruelty and violence were used. Because the crew members knew they would do whatever they wanted, the darkest of their desires about inflicting pain would manifest. Enslaved individuals who refused to eat were often flogged as a means of coercion. The crew was determined to keep their human cargo alive, as each death represented a financial loss. If flogging did not work, the crew would resort to using tools that opened the mouths of the captives to feed them. They used a device called a speculum oris, a long, thin mechanical contraption designed to open the mouth. Women on slave ships faced additional dangers, particularly sexual violence and abuse. This served multiple purposes beyond the immediate gratification of the perpetrators. These assaults were not only acts of violence and domination, but also calculated tools of psychological warfare aimed at breaking the spirit of the enslaved and establishing authority over them. Sexual violence was used as a method to instill fear, sow discord, and suppress any thoughts of rebellion among the enslaved captives. On slave ships, captains and crew members frequently sexually assaulted Black African women as a means of asserting their power and dominance over the entire captive population. These assaults were often conducted in public or in the presence of other enslaved individuals, particularly men, to maximize their psychological impact. By assaulting women in this way, the captors sought to demonstrate their absolute control over the enslaved and to remind them of their total powerlessness. Before we continue further, tell us, are you enjoying the video? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black Africa. Let's continue now. In many instances, the women targeted for sexual violence were deliberately chosen for their relationships with the male captives, wives, sisters, daughters, or other close relatives. This choice was intended to amplify the psychological trauma inflicted upon both the women and the men who were forced to witness these horrific acts. By assaulting a woman who was known to the men, the crew could directly challenge the men's ability to protect their loved ones, undermining any sense of solidarity or mutual defense that might foster resistance or rebellion. The sexual assault of a woman before her community, particularly by a figure of power like the captain, sent a clear message: the enslaved had no rights, no protections, and no control over their bodies or the bodies of their loved ones. This act of sexual violence was intended to break the spirit of both the individual women and the larger group, creating an atmosphere of terror that would discourage any thoughts of resistance. Sexual violence against enslaved women on slave ships also functioned as a form of psychological fight. The assaults were designed to break down the social structures and bonds that existed among the enslaved Africans. By raping a woman in front of her husband, brother, or father, the captors could inflict profound psychological trauma on the men, who were rendered helpless and forced to confront their inability to protect their kin. This helplessness served to demoralize the men and discourage any potential for organized resistance. The dehumanization involved in these acts was a critical component of the captors' strategy. By treating the women as objects to be used and abused at will, the enslavers reinforced the notion that the enslaved were less than human. This dehumanization was not just a psychological tool, but also a practical one. It was easier for the captors to justify their brutal treatment of the enslaved if they viewed them as subhuman. The public sexual exploitation of women served to strip the enslaved of their dignity and humanity, making it psychologically easier for the crew to maintain control. The sexual assault of women on slave ships also served to break down any sense of solidarity or unity that might have existed among the enslaved Africans. By targeting women in such a brutal and public manner, the captors sought to create divisions among the enslaved. The men might feel shame or guilt for their inability to protect the women, while the women might feel resentment toward the men for their perceived helplessness. This breakdown of unity and trust was a deliberate tactic to prevent the enslaved from organizing or banding together to resist their captors. The captain and crew played a central role in perpetuating the cycle of sexual violence on slave ships. The captain, as the authority figure on the ship, set the tone for how the enslaved would be treated. If the captain condoned or even encouraged sexual violence, the crew members would feel empowered to engage in similar acts without fear of repercussion. In some cases, the captain himself would participate in or initiate the sexual assault of an enslaved woman to demonstrate his dominance. But things did not stop at sexual exploitation. The brutalities went far beyond that. In most cases, when the slave ships reached the New World and investors asked about why the number of slaves was less, the captain presented cut-off ears of the slaves. Why was this done? Well, the conditions aboard slave ships during the Middle Passage were beyond horrific. Ship captains, driven by the desire to maximize profits, often loaded their vessels with far more enslaved Africans than the ships were designed to carry. This led to extreme overcrowding, where men, women, and children were packed tightly into the lower decks, sometimes with less than a few feet of space to lie down. These conditions led to a high mortality rate among the enslaved. It was common for 10% to 20% of the captives to die during the journey due to disease, malnutrition, and the brutal treatment they received from the crew. However, the deaths of enslaved individuals posed a significant problem for the captains. The loss of cargo meant a loss of profit. Additionally, the overcrowding itself sometimes made the ships dangerously heavy, particularly if they encountered rough seas or storms, which could lead to the ship taking on water or even sinking. To manage the ship's weight and to curb the spread of disease, captains would often decide to dispose of both the dead and living enslaved people by throwing them overboard. This act was not just an attempt to prevent further deaths due to disease or to reduce the ship's load, but was also a calculated economic decision. In some cases, captains might throw overboard living enslaved individuals who were sick or deemed unlikely to survive the journey, reducing the ship's burden and attempting to protect the rest of the cargo. When enslaved individuals were thrown overboard, captains needed a way to prove this loss to the ship's owners or to claim insurance. This is where the practice of dismembering the ears comes into play. The ears of the enslaved who were thrown into the sea were cut off before disposal and kept as proof of the loss. This gruesome practice allowed the captain to demonstrate that a certain number of enslaved individuals had been dumped from the ship, whether due to death or because they were no longer deemed valuable cargo. The dismembered ears would be presented as evidence upon the ship's arrival at its destination, particularly when the captain sought to claim insurance compensation. If a ship's cargo was insured, the insurers would require proof that the loss of enslaved individuals was necessary and not due to negligence. The captain could then argue that the disposal of these individuals was an act of necessity to save the rest of the cargo or the ship itself, justifying the claim. Despite the brutal conditions and the overwhelming odds against them, enslaved Africans on slave ships did not always submit passively to their fate. There were numerous instances of resistance and rebellion during the Middle Passage, though these efforts were rarely successful. Rebellions on slave ships typically involved enslaved men who attempted to overpower the crew and take control of the ship. These insurrections were often planned in secret and coordinated by the men, with women sometimes playing a crucial role in organizing the resistance. However, the chances of success were slim, as the crew was armed and prepared to respond with deadly force. Insurrections were usually met with fierce punishment, including executions and mass killings of the rebels. One of the most notorious incidents of resistance occurred on the slave ship Zong in 1781. After a 2-month journey of navigational errors, disease, and a shortage of fresh water, the ship's captain, Luke Collingwood, decided to throw 130 enslaved Africans overboard to drown. Collingwood justified this atrocity by claiming that the deaths were necessary to prevent the spread of disease, and he sought to claim insurance compensation for the lost cargo. In addition to physical rebellion, many enslaved individuals resisted through acts of defiance, such as refusing to eat, refusing to exercise, or attempting suicide. Suicide was seen by some captives as a way to escape the horrors of slavery and reclaim their dignity in death. To prevent such acts, slave ships were often outfitted with suicide nets designed to catch those who attempted to jump overboard. If a captive did manage to jump into the sea, the crew would often send boats to retrieve them, not out of compassion, but to prevent the loss of valuable property. After enduring 6 to 8 weeks of unimaginable suffering aboard the slave ship, the surviving captives arrived at ports in the Americas. But even though this was the end of a horrific journey, it was the beginning of a life of slavery. The end of the Middle Passage marked the beginning of a new chapter of suffering, as the enslaved were sold into a lifetime of forced labor and exploitation. Upon arrival, the enslaved Africans were often subjected to further humiliation and dehumanization. They were taken to a merchant's yard, where they were kept together like livestock, without regard to age or gender. Olaudah Equiano, a former enslaved African who became an influential abolitionist, recalled that upon arrival, many enslaved people initially believed they would be eaten by their captors. To quiet their fears and prevent panic, the slavers often brought seasoned slaves on board to reassure the new arrivals that they were not to be eaten, but to work. These older slaves would tell them that they were about to be taken ashore, where they would encounter others from their homeland. Once they were landed, the enslaved were immediately prepared for sale. This process often involved further cleaning and grooming to make them appear more presentable to potential buyers. They were then displayed at auctions or slave markets, where they were inspected like commodities. Buyers would examine the enslaved people's teeth, muscles, and overall health to assess their value as laborers. Families were routinely separated during these sales, with parents, children, and siblings often sold to different owners, a practice that added to the psychological trauma and heartbreak of enslavement. The Middle Passage was not only a physical journey, but also a profound psychological and emotional ordeal. The conditions on the slave ships were designed to break the spirit of the captives and prepare them for a life of forced servitude. Yet despite the unimaginable hardships they faced, many enslaved Africans retained a sense of their cultural identity and resilience. They resisted through small acts of defiance, retained their languages and spiritual practices, and formed new communities and kinship networks in the Americas. Can you imagine the thoughts of these millions of Africans who were living their peaceful lives all around Africa, enjoying themselves with their families? Isn't it true that when they were taken to the slave ships and chained in the lower decks of the ships, their hearts were full of agony? In the comments section right below, share your thoughts on the transatlantic slave trade that parted over 12 million families, enslaved 12 million people, and resulted in the death of over 2 million. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We bring videos on Black Africa, its history, rich arts and culture, and things the world should know about. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.